Hi, this is Dave, Director of Cosmere Festival, and welcome to a very special End of the World Reading Club just for Cosmere Festival 2020. We normally do these once a month, but we decided to do 3 in 8 days for the festival because we've got so many books that we want to talk about. We just couldn't help but do some sharing. So this is a slightly shorter session. And we're talking about a book which is in an interesting place, I think, in terms of what we've read over the last kind of 6 to 7, 8 months. We've read a lot of books in the End of the World Reading Club that are about apocalypses or post-apocalyptic worlds or about apocalypses yet to come. And the book that we're going to talk about this morning is Chosen Ones by, which I need to edit this banner. Oh, that's very silly of me, isn't it? I'm just going to edit that banner now so that you can see the right name instead of The Chosen Ones. Chosen Ones by Veronica Roth. Now, we picked this book to talk about as part of the Cosmere Festival because it is by a very popular author who wrote the Divergent series, but is the first adult book. So we thought this was the perfect book to talk about during the half term for older readers that have loved Divergent and maybe now are reading adult fiction. So there are some content warnings. This book does have swearing in it, and it has a lot more adult themes. It's quite an intense book. There's lots of things going on in it, which are definitely for an adult reader. But if you are someone that's grown up reading the Divergent theories and then you're looking for something from the author that is an adult version, then this could be a really good one for you. I am just going to make sure that we have all the things ticked. So you can hopefully watch us live now on YouTube, on Twitter and on Twitch. I've just added the Twitch in. And leave your comments now. I'll bring them up on the screen and feed them in if they're relevant. But also you can watch this back on our YouTube channel afterwards. We're doing a recording of it, so you'll get the whole shebang. So, as I said, this is a shorter session. We're going to talk until about 12 o'clock about this book. I've got a few notes here, but it'd also be great to hear from you if you've read this book, what you think about it. Because this always works best if there's a bit of back and forth between people. So, what can I tell you about The Chosen Ones? It's a pretty new book. You can tell that because I've got it in a hardback edition, which I don't have a lot of hardback books at the moment, and it was actually published at the beginning of this year. I'm not going to tell you too much about Veronica Roth because she's a pretty famous author, but as I mentioned, she's most famous for the Divergent series, which has been a massive success, and she's really invested in supporting books for young adult readers. So this is definitely a foray into something new. Now, the plot of Chosen Ones is something that I think is really interesting, and it's the reason why I picked up a copy. The book is about a group of young adults who, in the year kind of 2019, 2020, who have saved the world 10 years before. So they've had to fight against something evil and been successful, and then they're dealing with the consequences of that. Now, we're going to do some spoilers in this video. We're going to get into some spoilers. This is how our reading clubs normally work. So if you've not read the book, then you might want to tune out and not have it spoiled for you. But if you have read the book and you've got some thoughts, leave them in the comments. It'd be great to hear from you. So the book is written mostly from the perspective of Sloane, one of those chosen ones who've saved the world. And then there's other bits and pieces of writing in there which help build the world around it, which I think I'm going to talk about first, because that really is how the book starts. So right there at the beginning, actually, you've got a tribute to Chicago and then a gorgeous map of Chicago. I don't know if you can see that on the screen. And then you dive into kind of documents. You have a standout routine, you have a magazine article, and you have an academic article. And that style, that mixing of documents and interviews and reports in the newspaper, papers, theoretical papers. This continues throughout the story and is something that I thought was really interesting and worth me talking about to kick things off, because it kicks the book off. We don't start with somebody's personal story. We start with how other people see Sloane, and we start with other perspectives on what's happened. It's a really nice framing device for me. It's nice because you're starting with a comedy routine, which is not something you get very often. But also what I think Veronica Roth does very well is that she uses those frameworks, those different ways of telling a story to help build the narrative up and to build the backstory in. Something you often get when you're writing stories like this is that you have characters who are reflecting on their past all the time in a way that would be unrealistic, because most people just get on with their lives. And actually there is lots of looking back from the characters, but it's very specific and emotional and personal looking back from our main character Sloane, and in interactions with others about their personal experiences. So the framing mechanism of using all these other sources helps build out the world, show different perspectives, and also do some of that exposition, some of that world building in ways which feel a bit more real, but also build up over time. So we can guess some of the things that happen, and we can also guess, and we can not guess some of the things that happen, and that writing can surprise us. The other thing that is really nice, and this is a little bit spoilery, is that our main character Sloane is also doing some of this document discovery themselves. All the way through the story, they are researching these kind of collections and reading them and learning from them. So her experience and ours are slightly paralleled there. I thought that was also really great. So that is kind of how the story is told. It's that mix of documents and first-person storytelling. And it takes a bit of time to get into. I think I made a note that it felt slightly clunky at the beginning, but it gets into its rhythm of it quite quickly, and I didn't think that it was that clunky by the end at all. I think it worked really nicely. Now the story is in 3 parts, and the first part takes place in a world that might be our own with some slight tweaks. The second part takes place somewhere else, and one thing that I really liked was that storytelling mechanic moved with us into that other place and that other story. We just got different sources and different perspectives. I would have expected as a reader that maybe we didn't get all of that, and it was really nice to have that experience. So let's talk a little bit about this world then. So the whole story is set in Chicago, or 2 Chicagos. I don't want to give too much away about those 2 Chicagos are, but they're alternative versions of each other. And that first Chicago is a kind of Chicago that is true to life now, as far as I know. I'm not a massive Chicago expert, but has been through some experiences that echo some real life events like New York in the start of the 21st century and the 2 Towers. So it's a landscape that has been changed by catastrophe and by disaster, and people are living with the memories and the reality of those experiences. Society is. The other thing to know quite from the off is that it is a bit sweary. This is definitely a reason why it's a book for adults. I think if that wasn't in there, then it would be probably a slightly different demographic would be interested. But as it is, that is where we're up to. I'm just taking a look and see if there's any comments. Nothing has come through just yet. If you are watching and you have some comments, please leave them in the chat and we will include them. That'd be really great. And there were some really interesting nods to some media that I really love. And we'll talk about that maybe through this prism of chosen ones. Now, for someone that's my age, that is a phrase that is very evocative of one particular series, which is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Buffy is the chosen one. And then by the end of that story, spoilers if you've not watched Buffy and you're watching it now, close your ears or skip on. That there are chosen ones throughout the story, and by the end there are lots of chosen ones. So I like this idea that there was supposed to be one chosen one, but actually what we've ended up with is a group of them, and they've worked collectively to save the planet. That is a nice twist, I think, on normal stories where there is one central person and then there is the support crew. Here, they are a kind of chosen one's team. I don't think I've seen that anywhere else. If you have, leave that in the comments. And those echoes, particularly of Buffy, the kind of training side of things, lots of emphasis, particularly in part 2 and 3, on books and reading and learning, rather than using the internet for your research. So you kind of tap into that kind of librarian side of things you get in Buffy. I thought that was all really interesting, but this was a nice fresh spin on it. It also was obviously a book that was written before the events of this year, but can't help but have echoes for the reader. And there was a line really early on page 28 in the hardback. Anything from 100 to 1 million people was just a number. And this is the reason why I wanted to talk about this book as part of the festival this year. We're living through something that feels, for all of us, incredibly catastrophic and life-changing and world-changing. And that is very much what's happened to the characters in this story. What we get a glimpse of here is what happens when you've been through that experience as a society, as individuals, 10 years down the track. And what's happened to the chosen ones is that they are celebrities. They're celebrities who are known the world over for saving the world. Their stories are splashed on the tabloids. They've become like a celebrity, a reality TV star, because our society only has that framework for putting people in place. And some of our characters have embraced it. They've become Instagram stars, and some of them have shied away from that fame because it wasn't their choice. And I think there's a nice comment there on our contemporary society and how we only have certain ways of dealing with people that are in the public eye. And they aren't necessarily always the healthiest ways of dealing with people in the public eye, particularly people who are in the public eye not by their choice, but by circumstance. I'm sure all of you can think of examples of people who have stepped up and then been made the target of something despite them just trying to do their best. And actually, American viewers and people that have been following American pandemic activity this year might recognize that in someone like Fauci, the kind of medical voice of the American government, and how he's had to take on security guards because just by being in the public eye, he's become public property, even though he's just doing his job, which is to try and keep people safe and alive. So I thought that was very prescient, I think, from Veronica Roth, that she identifies that this is the kind of thing that can happen in a horrible situation and that it's not necessarily the healthiest way of doing things. And there's a nice contrast there, I think, with part 2, which is the alternative Chicago, that I'm not going to spoil too much. This is a society for some pretty good reasons, though I think I would argue that they're not necessarily entirely bang on reasons, that they don't have that same internet culture. Their society's developed in a different way, and they've got a different way of doing things. And what we've ended up with in that context is a society where you can be away from the public eye. And even if you're important, people don't necessarily know much about you or what you look like or what you do. People who are saving the world are perhaps doing it in the shadows rather than up front. And I thought that was interesting. So if you've got comments about that, please let me know. I think there's also a really strong tone here of that saving the world is not the end. It's not the end of everything. And that's another reason why it appealed to me, not only to kind of dig into how people get through a process like this, but also that this is a story where the end of the world has already happened. Quite often, saving the world is the climax of a story, And obviously, in this case, it is not even really in the story. It is something that has already happened, and I thought that was fascinating. And we get a real sense. This is quite a slow burn story for me. I think the kind of action side of it doesn't really get going until probably halfway through. But what you do get is a really thoughtful examination of how does a country, how does a world process what's happened. And I think Roth is interested in exploring some of the negative ways that society might do that. So that's by venerating the bad side of things. And we can see that happen in our world today. It is sometimes about hero worship, whether the heroes are deserving of worship or not. Just the very fact they've done something that has saved the world is enough to make them heroes for some people. And then some of those shades of grey in between. And obviously also the way that faith structures can sometimes develop around things that are in the public eye and are really and a really massive effects on the planet. So yeah, there's a lot to unpick there, I think, about our contemporary celebrity society, the way that we deal with things that have happened. And I thought that that comedy routine at the beginning is perhaps instructive of that. If I think about the way that the pandemic and politics at the moment is dealt with, quite often the voices that we see, particularly online, are those of comedians and talk show hosts doing comedy as a way of helping people to understand what's going on and process it. And that very first routine is, I guess, a kind of it's supposed to be about the name of the Dark One and where it came from, and how the Dark One is a really that's a very sweary page. How the Dark One is a very very generic name for something, and that actually we could be more creative. It's a way of taking away, after the effect, taking away some of the stresses and the concerns for people. And to move back to our chosen ones, they don't have that luxury. We see a range of characters who are really struggling to deal with the after effects of saving the world, something you never ever think about when you're watching a Marvel movie, although they get into that a little bit, I think, in some of the stories, or anything else where the world has been saved. You just assume that everybody's going to bask in that glow of celebrity and then kind of move on with their lives. And this book shows that that's not necessarily the reality of things. What's much more likely to happen is that people have been through traumatic events, they've got survivor guilt, they have got experiences that they just can't get over, can't deal with, and also they might struggle to find their place in the world. This is particularly key here for the chosen ones because they're very young when they're kind of plucked from their situations and put into a training program to save the world. And I thought that that's there's some good parallels there with maybe child actors and child stars, and the way that they sometimes the way that people struggle when they finish with that point of their lives to kind of get on with the rest of their lives. What job do you do if you save the world? And it's the options are limited. It's being a star. It's being a public speaker. It's not having a real everyday life job. And one of the main characters we meet in part 2, they are in a similar kind of situation, or might be, but they also have a bit of a job, and that's probably something I'm thinking of off the top of my head. Is quite an interesting way to think about things. The other element that I really wanted to talk about was Project Ringer. So this is the kind of secret government project to find and train the chosen one, or the chosen one candidates. This was a part of the book that I thought worked a bit less well for me. It felt a little bit more generic than some of the rest of the story. It kind of felt a little bit paint by numbers. They were just mostly anonymous government agents and perhaps some bits of it were slightly underdeveloped. There was, although that could be intentional, and I'd love to know what you think about this. So one of the characters that we don't meet because they're not around anymore, but we hear about and we kind of read about, is Bert, who is the handler for the Chosen Ones. And quite often in stories like this, the handler is a main character. Going back to Buffy, you think about Giles as a character. He's a part of the crew, he's a part of the team, and he's a big part of the story. And there are loads of similar examples in all kinds of stories where somebody is plucked from obscurity and trained to save the world. But in this story, we never meet him, really. If you've read the book, you know what I mean by "and really." But you don't get that dynamic where they've got somebody who is helping them save the world. And I don't think I quite have straight in my head why that is, why that's the situation. It maybe it's because that was an interesting story, or because Bert not being there meant that the characters could have a bit of distance on what that relationship was. And it also meant that they were immediately removed from the government, which was useful, I think, for their independence and for what happens later on in the story. But it did feel a little bit underdeveloped for me compared to some of the writing and some of the story building. I don't know if it was just the victim of the fact that it's a pretty chunky book. What we're looking at here, about just shy of 400 pages in hardback. So it's there's a lot going on already. Maybe that was just a kind of victim of there being too much to talk about. I am just having a little look now. As I said before, any comments you want to drop in? I think we might have, this is our first one on Twitch. We might have somebody watching on Twitch. You're very welcome if you are watching us. I have no idea if Twitch comments pop up in here, so we could always test that if you've got something you want to contribute. Okay, so let's talk about these two worlds. This is quite spoilery. I've been kind of holding off on this a little bit until now to give people a chance to hear a bit about the story. So we've got two Chicagos that are going on here. The first Chicago, as I mentioned before, is very much like our own. From what I know of Chicago in popular fiction, it felt pretty accurate in terms of the places and the people. The alternative Chicago is still called Chicago, but it also has a second name. And it's in a world where magic has been around for a lot longer, since the 1960s. And the book plays with a little bit, although not massively, with this idea of parallel universes. And this being an alternative way of doing things. It had a real resonance for me, actually, with Fringe. This is the second video I've made which references Fringe, but what you're going to do? It's an incredibly influential story, I think. So in Fringe, you've kind of got two worlds, and the actions of one influenced the other one. And there's an element of that here in this story, in that the two parallel universes are symbiotically linked. Stuff that's happened in one is the effect of something that's happened in the other. And some of our chosen ones find themselves transported from our-ish universe through to this one where magic is there. Magic is in both, but in a much different way. And because it's been there for quite a while, it's had a profound impact on the way that society's developed. And as I mentioned before, one of those things is that the internet isn't necessarily there in the same way. And I thought it was worth maybe talking about what that means, what that looks like, because I think it's quite interesting. I think it's quite interesting why something like magic might come along and have an effect on how society develops, and what Roth thinks the internet is doing that in another world magic would be doing. So we'll just have to see. We'll just have to see what you think about that, because it'd be great to get your theories on that. For me, I wonder whether What magic gives people is a sense of wonder and a sense of connection. And maybe that's something that Roth thinks the internet kind of fills for us, definitely on the connection side, but it's also about self-expression. And the internet has also developed as a way to make our lives easier. That's been one of the drivers. Easier to communicate. There's the whole kind of Internet of Things and computers there to drive systems and drive processes. And in our alternative Chicago, magic is doing a lot of that. Magic is, and it's also filling people's lives. They're constantly doing stuff with their abilities in the world. And if we are walking around or we're filling all of our time on our devices, then we are not necessarily filling our time with anything else. And maybe magic just takes up that whole space. There's also definitely some world building there, which is about the resources that are required to think about what magic is, how it works, how it can be manipulated and engineered, and which takes away from the energy of doing all the other stuff. And this is really, for me, symbolized by their kind of shrouds that people wear to help channel their magic abilities. And the company that makes them is very much Apple, but with a different name. It's I think it might even be IBM that has become the company. I can't quite recall. So all of that energy and that resource that went into making smaller devices and networking them, all that engineering potential has instead gone on something that is a lot more immediate and a lot more noticeable and a lot more useful for society. So it's definitely had an effect. I'd love to know your comments, either live in the chat now or afterwards in the comments on the video on YouTube. What do you think? Do you think that's right, or do you think even with a kind of magical world, people would still have that other desire to communicate? Was it the technology leading society or society leading the technology in that instance? Because for me, it feels like it's maybe a bit of both. But despite anything else, it means it's a really interesting story. There's also an element there about Google and their initial mission of organizing the world's information, which is redundant when magic can help you do the organizing for you. So yeah, really fascinating, but obviously a real challenge for our main characters in that they're in a world where not only do they not know what's going on, they don't have recourse to their normal ways of finding out. And perhaps it should make us all feel that, you know, our world's changed quite dramatically in 30 years, and that how would we cope if we suddenly lost all of those capabilities? Just looking through my notes. Another thing that really fascinated me, and I'm not sure if I've got a theory yet on why it is that in our parallel Chicago, lots of people have been really influenced by, allegedly anyway, by Roman names. I'm not sure how true this is, having read the book, but there obviously is some elements there to it. I'd love to know there's a lot of very interesting words here, which I haven't had time to look up because we've been very busy with the festival. The parallel of Earth has been given a kind of magic name that goes with its Earth, which is Genetrix. I don't think I quite know what Genetrix means, but if you've got an idea or a theory or some knowledge, then put it in the chat, because I'm always, if you've watched any of these streams before, fascinated by the terms for things, by what they mean, and what they can tell you about the story. And there is one character in the second and third parts whose name I should have really thought more about, and it makes a lot more sense to me now I've read the book than it did when I was reading it. So I would highly recommend you pay attention to that. And Sloane's name is maybe a good example. So when I've looked at some of the reviews for this book, some of the criticism have been who we're hearing the story from, because the chosen ones as a collective are quite a diverse bunch, and they deal with some of the challenges of being a diverse bunch as part of the story. But our main character is the least diverse of all of them. This could have easily been swapped and changed around. It could have been any of them could have been in the situation. But I wonder whether this was a very deliberate act from Roth to investigate some of those things that she wanted to talk about. My clue into this is that the character is called Sloane, and if you're based in the UK, that certainly makes me think about the term Sloane Ranger, which is a kind of quite entitled, well-to-do person normally living in London who kind of swan about and just go and have coffee and go for runs and don't do much else. Now, this isn't the character of Sloane in the book. She's had an incredibly tough upbringing and has managed to claw her way back through lots of trauma to some semblance of a life, although she's barely clinging on. So what's that name doing? Is that name suggesting that we should look deeper than just the name and always keep in mind where she's come from? And also, is she a bit of a kind of blank vessel for the story rather than a really strongly defined character? I think I'm on the fence at the moment. I didn't mind spending those hours in her company, even though she's very clearly not a heroine, not a hero, got lots of flaws, lots of faults, acts very much in a human way in lots of instances, but also difficult to love. She makes some horrible decisions, which as a reader, you're just kind of screaming and you want to shake the book and say, what are you doing? So it'd be great to know your comments on how you think this character worked, whether it would have been better to have somebody with a different perspective, or whether you think actually this character worked very well for the story. So also in our parallel world, we can explore some other things which are maybe more kind of sci-fi fantasy tropes that are reflections of the modern world, but aren't direct parallels. And having this kind of parallel version of Chicago and surrounding area does that for us. I'm thinking very specifically about the kind of haves and have-nots. So in our parallel world, some people have got abilities, some people don't, some people want abilities and some people don't. And there's a comment here. It's not necessarily the most sophisticated comment, I don't think, but it's there and it's interesting about a society that works in that way. The parallel Chicago is a very unequal society. There is even a snippet in here, which is a story about the new kind of magic sleeve coming out, the kind of premium one, the iPhone Max version or the kind of MacBook Pro version of something, which is it's a status symbol and it's only for the most elite. I think what Roth is saying here is pointing out to us, it's reminding us that no matter what the society's structured like, if it's built along these lines, if it's built along lines of ours, people will find ways to differentiate and to give privileged people more and more privilege, more and more control, and that is not popular with everybody. But if you've got the power, and literally the power in this case, then there's very little you can do about it. I think that was really fascinating for me in both worlds, actually, is that Chicago feels like it's the center of the world. Quite often when we read these stories, it's New York or LA, the kind of or Washington, the kind of cultural or the political center places of American society, certainly. But here in this story, a bit like with Boston, I think in Fringe, and like lots of TV where it's set in a place, it feels like all the action then happens in that place. So it's definitely a love letter to Chicago and giving Chicago a place in the sun or in the snow, as it often seems to be snowing when you see it on television. So I'd love to know whether you think about the fact that it's set in Chicago and whether that was something that was unexpected for you, or if it felt very like it kind of didn't matter where we were set. And not knowing Chicago, I don't know how much the character of the city has an influence on the story and the setting. Because much as for me, not knowing it, much as it's very evocative of the city. You get the places, you get the streets. I don't know if it could have been set somewhere else for me. You'd have just used different buildings, different streets. So it'd be great to know whether there's layers to this that I'm not necessarily picking up on that you might do as a reader, because it feels like there's more for me to get there. Definitely. Okay, I've got about 9 minutes left if we go all the way through to 12 o'clock. I think we've got a very loyal Twitch watcher who has been going all the way through. If you've got anything you want to contribute, drop it in the comments now and I can pull it up on screen. Anything you want to talk about as part of this book would be absolutely brilliant. We have had some other people pop in and out on other services, which is nice. If you just want to listen to me talk, that's fine too. I'm probably I think I've got maybe one or two more things to talk about, and then it'll be onto my advertising for the other stuff that we've got going on between now and the end of the festival, which will be in a couple of days. And then I'll bid you adieu and see you for the next one. So, what was the last thing that maybe we would want to talk about? Let's go back to the characters and what they're experiencing, because that is the thrust of this story, obviously, and about personal relationships. Something that I thought was really interesting in here was the relationship between the chosen ones. And a situation that I think is probably common to a lot of us. When you're in a situation with a group of people, you've been through something, anything, positive or negative, you have a bond. You have a bond that you can't explain to anybody else. You have in-jokes, you have relationships, you have experiences that you want to talk about, and you can only do it with those people. It's a really pleasing feeling a lot of the time because you've been through it. But in this case, it's obviously a traumatic experience, and these are characters that have mostly clung to each other. It's interesting that two of our characters are in a relationship. Two of them live together as friends, and the last character would be living there but has had to kind of move home for family reasons. So these are characters that have essentially got nobody else. They've got no one they haven't widened their circle at all in 10 years to include anybody else because it's been so traumatic. And I'm hoping that's going to be very different for the society that we're living in right now. We're all going through this pandemic and we're kind of all going through it on the same level. And that is definitely very different from this story where it's a very unique, small experience for the heroes and then a big experience for everybody else. So we might end up with a small group of heroes, scientists who create a vaccine. So it's maybe a note for all of us to be sensitive to those people, sensitive to their needs, because they're going to feel some very strange things about saving the world. Okay, I think that's enough of me talking about the book. I really enjoyed it. It's not necessarily my favorite book that I've read this year. You can head to our YouTube channel if you want to see all of the other books that we have read. In fact, I am going to leave a comment in here. Maybe I'm not going to leave a comment in there. Yeah, you can head to our YouTube channel. And that's easily Googleable, Cosmic Festival, if you want to watch back some of our other book talks that we've done, or if you want to see any of our other content about writing. But what I would say is it's a really interesting perspective on post-apocalyptic stories, the kind of post-apocalyptic. And it's something that I know I will carry through me when I read other stories. And I'm thinking about those characters and what's going to happen to them afterwards. So I think this book is going to linger for me in my imagination, and hopefully it will in yours too. Okay. that's the end of the book chat. So as I mentioned at the start, this event is part of Cosmere Festival 2020. We are based here in not very sunny West Yorkshire, but the festival is almost all taking place online this year. And we've still got 2.5 days of activities and events to run, including hearing from lots of authors. So if you visit our website, if you're watching this live or you're going to be catching up on it in the next day or so, we've got author talks going on. We are doing another End of the World Reading Club, which is going to happen on Sunday, the 1st of November at 11:30. And we're going to be talking about this classic of kind of climate change, post-apocalyptic storytelling, Anna Kavan's Ice, and putting it in the context of post-apocalyptic works and the works that we've been talking about since April as part of the End of the World Reading Club. So if you want to read this book, if you want to come and chat about books that you love, we will have that space for an hour on Sunday morning. And again, that'll be available for catch-up on our YouTube channel afterwards. So hopefully there's lots in there for you to get your teeth into and to enjoy. We've got some great authors coming up for the rest of the programme. And as ever, stay safe and we'll see you soon.